Hello and welcome to another episode of 1000 Actually Fun Books, where we review books of every genre looking for the best of fun escapist books. So today we're doing a young adult adventure story, Watership Down by Richard Adams. And as you can kind of see, my copy is in pretty poor shape. It's kind of fallen apart there. I have had this since high school, which has been several decades ago, and it was my favorite book when I was in high school, college age. If anybody asked, that was the book I would pick. So you already know this is going to be a recommendation. Normally I don't do books that I've already previously read or give away the ending right at the beginning here, but I wanted to give the disclaimer that I'd previously read this book, but I decided to reread it. It's been 20 years, let's do it again. And then I can tell you what it's all about. So, this book is kind of hard to describe to somebody who's never read it before. The closest analogy I can get to is Bambi. You have real animals. These aren't animals that have clothing or technology. They're real. But the author makes it more relatable because they talk, they think like a person as opposed to an animal. And then it's just kind of their lives. And in this adventure, there's a little bit more fantasy than Bambi, but just a touch more. And what it is one of the rabbits has, we'll say, premonitions. Maybe they verge on actual visions of the future. Something that's the extent of the fantasy in this. Everything else would be grounded in reality as much as you can with rabbits that have a culture. The plot is, it starts out with two brother rabbits, and they're just feeding along around their group, which is called a warren. They're feeding around the holes of rabbits, and the younger brother has those premonitions. This is right at the beginning. He basically says, something bad is coming. There's something bad. And his brother's like, well, okay, you've been right before. Let's take this bad feeling to our chief rabbit. The rabbit that's going to make the decisions for the entire group of rabbits. And so they go and tell him, and they say this bad thing is coming. And the chief rabbit is like, a bad thing you say. Can you tell me more about this? And the rabbit's like, no, just something bad. Well, what do you think we should do about it? Well, we should all leave. Everybody should get up and leave. And the chief rabbit's like, yeah, do you think that would really work? I mean, we've got mothers with babies. People are not going to want to leave. And even if we did, the enemies would pick us off en masse. We'd be vulnerable away from our holes. And logically, as you think it through, as the rabbits do later, they're like, it makes sense. I mean, the idea of, even if a bad thing came through, wouldn't most of the rabbits survive? Even if it was a plague or something, most of the rabbits would end up surviving. So leaving would be worse than staying, no matter what bad thing it is. But the rabbit with visions is like, no, we need to leave. So he convinces his brother and a couple other rabbits, and they end up convincing several other rabbits, let's go, let's find another place, find another home. So about a dozen rabbits leave together. And it might be, I might have the count wrong, maybe 11 or something like that, but about a dozen. And they leave, and what I've just told you is about the first couple of chapters, 2 or 3 chapters. Most of the book is then their journey to find a new home, and then once they have a new home, they discover problems, and then how do they overcome that. It's a lot of like a quest, like an adventure, where the author brings up obstacles and complications and problems, and the story is constantly having to overcome all of these. And so it's pure adventure for the most part. So that's kind of, really briefly, in a nutshell, the idea of the story. And some of the things I really like about this, there's a lot to like about it, one of which is the plot itself. So the obstacles that they overcome are constantly coming, not at a frantic pace. The pacing in this book is good. It's excellent, in fact. You have kind of lazy summer days interspersed with, oh no, there's a dog loose in the woods, or whatever it may be. And the problems that they overcome are very varied. lots of variety in what they are. They're not all enemies. Could be other rabbits. It could be, something to do with the weather, or they want to do some sort of raid on a garden or something like that. There's lots of obstacles to overcome in this. They may encounter something that they've never seen before, and is this an enemy? Is this okay? What exactly is a road? That kind of stuff. Because these are real rabbits. Okay, so the plot is one of those great things about the story, the adventure itself. Really well done. The next thing I'll say is the characters. I fell in love with these characters. We have a huge slew of characters, and the author does a good job of not allowing you as the reader to get lost in the massive amount of characters, because you have your dozen to start with. I mean, that's a lot of characters to start with. But it focuses in narrowly enough on a handful of them that you can really follow through and understand who their personality is. And you end up really loving some of these characters, or at least I did. Like our main character, Hazel, ends up being the leader of this new group of rabbits. And he's not the smartest rabbit, he's not the strongest rabbit, but he is the best leader rabbit. He makes the best choices for the group. He is the one that encourages them and helps them overcome problems, making decisions, that kind of thing. And you just end up really rooting for him. He's not a super rabbit, but he's also not the kind of, superhero-esque, as in he doesn't have flaws, because he definitely makes some poor choices sometimes. But he's just great. He's the kind of personality that if it was a human, you would want to be friends with this person. And then they've got other rabbits, like Bigwig, for example. He starts out not terribly likable, a little bit of a bully. And he has the most character development, the most character growth throughout the entire story. By the end, you just love this rabbit because he is heroic and brave, and he's no longer as much of a bully, things like that, where he has grown a lot throughout the story, and you just really love him. And of course, there are a whole bunch of other characters. You've got Dandelion, who is a really fast runner, so if they need something done quick, he's the rabbit, and he's a great storyteller. If they want a story told, they go to Dandelion. Or Blackberry, who is the clever one of the group, who comes up with unique ways to solve problems and develop tricks and stuff. Speaking of tricks and storytelling, this book is full of a unique world-building culture. So the rabbits in this do have a culture. They tell stories. And this book has stories within stories. So hopefully you've never seen the movie because it was really bad, but in the movie, if you have, you know that they have a culture-building story of their origin. Where did rabbits come from? Why are they the way they are? It was a really creative way of their origin story. Their deity has made them and then blessed them. They blessed their bottom. And it was pretty funny, with strong hind legs and a shiny white tail. Anyway, and the story of why that is pretty fun. And then there are other stories. So they really admire tricksters. So a lot of their stories deal with tricking. Their heroic leader of the past who does all these tricks to solve problems or whatever. They tell stories about that. And those are fun. There are probably half a dozen stories in here of their culture storytelling, and they don't interrupt the story. Instead, it's like, wow, these are really interesting. I kind of want to have more of these trickster stories by themselves because they're really cute, chapter-long short stories within the story. And they tend to be relevant. Like, several of them come up as something that the rabbits refer to, like, oh, do you remember the story of the king's lettuce? Maybe something like that will help us here. That kind of thing. It's really interesting. So I liked their world building, the culture stuff that the rabbits have. The beautiful descriptions, so the author does a great job of kind of poetic sometimes language, usually describing the scenery. Now this kind of can verge on not so great because he does a little bit too much sometimes where you kind of skim through it, especially because there's a lot of, I think the author must be a hobbyist botanist because he has very detailed descriptions of such a huge variety of plants. most of which I know nothing about. Like, I know what a dandelion is, and I know what a beech tree is, but a bunch of these, you know, that I'm just like, I have no idea what it is. So it can be a little bit much. But it does come across sometimes very poetic, the way he's describing the scenery, the mist over the downs or whatever, a sunset over the hills or something. So that can be really nice. Okay, the last thing I'll say about things that I like is it is kind of lighthearted in tone. It's got humor. For example, one rabbit is mentioning something along the lines of, you know, I said a joke and rolled it out in front of us and we just followed the joke along down the road. And, you know, just things like that. Or there's a rabbit that tells a lot of jokes that comes up later in the book. So the last half of the book has more jokes than the front, but it can be humorous at times. But overall, the entire story is lighthearted. It does feel like a young adult in that sense. It doesn't have anything really dark or gritty or heavy. There are some moments that feel like they're really intense, but it really doesn't feel bad intense. Just intense, like there's action gonna happen kind of thing, or a tense moment of how are they gonna get out of this. But the overall tone over the whole story is tends to be lighthearted and happy, I guess. So I like that. Okay, on to the things that I didn't like. There's not much, but they are there. So the first thing is that it does have some made-up words. So the author decided that the rabbits needed, like the elves in Lord of the Rings or something, they need their own language, but only for a handful of words. So for example, I think it's Humbra is for a fox, and Siffle for feeding in the grass outside, things like that. There's about a 2-page glossary. Yeah, you can see the glossary of 2 pages of rabbit words. And so they can have some kind of random stuff. Most of the made-up words are really, either they come up enough that you get to be familiar with them or aren't really relevant even if you don't care. Some of them are just, you know, names, you know, like Fiver is because rabbits can't count above 4, you know, things like that. And so anyway, the author does some made-up words. Don't love it when authors do that too much. This one isn't overwhelming, fortunately. All right, my biggest thing that I dislike in that this author does is when the author addresses directly to the reader. Like the author in this book will say, and the reader will be familiar with this thing, or something like that. It usually happens at the beginning of a chapter, not very often. It doesn't come up very often in this book at all, but it does happen, and I'm not a fan of that kind of thing. I think it pulls you out of the narrative. But the author is doing it usually to give you an illustration of some principle. For example, in one part, it's talking about a human walking up and down a hill and the difference between that and what a rabbit experiences walking up and down a hill. For example, going down a hill, humans find it easier than going up because you are not pushing the bulk of your mass up against gravity, where a rabbit doesn't have that problem, but going downhill, because of their powerful back feet, they can, if they're running too fast, can end up going head over heels, tumbling down a hill, because, you know, their back feet push them too far if it's too steep. And so it talks about that phenomenon, and it's addressing the reader. And then right after that, you have the rabbit is going up a hill. So it's relevant to the story, but it kind of takes you out of the narrative. I do not like that. Again, it doesn't happen often, but enough for me to just say it happens, and yeah. Okay, that's pretty much it. As I said before, I give this 2 thumbs way up. I loved this story. I thought the adventure and the characters are just wonderful. And if you haven't read it before, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. Please go pick up a copy and try it. If it even slightly sounds like your cup of tea, if you like adventure stories, then this is a great adventure story. All right, well, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.